Zekthara's 4 eyes moved across the glowing screen as he read the intercepted human messages. The blue light from the display cast strange shadows on his scaled face as he worked in the quiet intelligence room of the Vortani research ship. Around him, other analysts bent over their own screens, but Zekthara focused only on the humans. The messages were simple and crude compared to the elegant communications of advanced species. Human ships used basic fusion engines that left heat trails across space like burning arrows. Their weapons shot metal slugs instead of refined energy beams. Even their military ranks seemed messy and informal compared to the perfect hierarchy of the Vortani Confederation. Zekthara had been studying humans for 6 months now. They were a young species, barely 200 years into space travel. Most galactic civilizations considered them barely worth notice. The Hegemony Empire certainly did. When they declared war on the human colony worlds, they sent only a small fleet. War Commander Thexmolin called humans primitive mammals in his official reports. That was 3 days ago. Now the Vortani Council was meeting in emergency session. The door to the intelligence room slid open with a soft hiss. Commander Veltoth entered, his ceremonial robes flowing behind him as he walked to Zekthara's station. The young analyst quickly stood and gave the proper salute, touching his forehead with 2 clawed fingers. "Analyst Zekthara," Commander Veltoth said in their native tongue. "You have been selected for a special assignment." Zekthara felt his stomach tighten. Special assignments usually meant dangerous work far from the safety of Vortani space. "I am honored, Commander. What does the Council require?" "The Council has decided to ally with the humans against the Hegemony. You will serve as a liaison officer aboard one of their warships. Your job is to observe, learn, and report back on human military capabilities." The words hit Zekthara like a cold wave. Living among humans, fighting alongside them, the thought made his scales itch with nervousness. "Commander, surely there are more experienced officers who could— You know their language better than anyone else in our fleet. You have studied their culture and military structure. The Council believes you are the best choice." Commander Veltoth's tone made it clear this was not a request. "You depart in 2 hours." 2 hours later, Zekthara found himself in a small transport shuttle flying toward the human fleet. Through the viewport, he could see their ships hanging in space like metal insects. They were smaller than Vortani vessels, but there were many of them. As they grew closer, he noticed something odd about their formation. Instead of the neat geometric patterns that civilized fleets used, the human ships were scattered in what looked like random positions. The shuttle docked with the largest human vessel, a ship called the Defiant Dawn. As the airlock cycled, Zekthara checked his translation device one more time and adjusted his breathing mask. Human atmosphere was thinner than what Vortani preferred, but he could survive it. The airlock opened and Zekthara stepped into his first human warship. The corridors were narrower than he expected, with exposed pipes and cables running along the walls. Everything looked functional but unpolished. A human female in uniform waited for him, her brown hair pulled back in a tight knot. "You must be our Vortani observer," she said, extending her hand in the human greeting gesture. "I'm Colonel Lisa Brady, Tactical Officer. Welcome aboard the Dawn." Zekthara carefully shook her hand, surprised by the firm grip. "I am Zekthara, Intelligence Analyst. I am honored to serve alongside your people. Come on, I'll show you to the Admiral. Fair warning, though, he's not big on ceremony." Colonel Brady led him through the corridors as crew members hurried past carrying equipment and supplies. None of them stopped to stare at the alien visitor, which surprised Zekthara. In Vortani culture, the arrival of a foreign observer would have been a major event. They reached a room marked Command Center, where several humans sat around a large table covered with star charts and tactical displays. At the head of the table sat a gray-haired man with tired eyes and scarred hands. He looked up as they entered. "Admiral Morrison," Colonel Brady said. "This is Zekthara, our Vortani liaison." Admiral Jake Morrison stood and nodded to Zekthara. "Welcome aboard. Hope you're ready for some excitement. The Hegemony fleet will be here in 4 days." Zekthara had expected formal introductions, ceremonial exchanges of credentials, perhaps even a feast in his honor. Instead, Admiral Morrison simply pointed to an empty chair. "Grab a seat. We're just going over the battle plan." For the next 3 hours, Zekthara listened as the humans discussed their strategy. What he heard confused him. They talked about acceptable losses and calculated risks in the same casual tone they might use to discuss the weather. Captain Amy Rodriguez, commander of a destroyer called Swift Strike, actually laughed when Admiral Morrison assigned her ship to what was clearly a suicide mission. "Sounds like fun, sir. My crew loves a good scrap." She turned to the other captains. "Last one to ram an enemy cruiser buys the drinks." The other humans chuckled. Zekthara's translator must be malfunctioning. Surely they were not joking about ramming enemy ships. Dr. Kevin Walsh, the fleet's chief medical officer, sat quietly through most of the meeting. When Admiral Morrison asked about casualty projections, the doctor simply said, "We'll save who we can. The rest will die fighting." He said it the same way he might comment on a minor injury. As the meeting broke up, Colonel Brady showed Zekathara to his quarters. The room was small but clean, with a viewport looking out at the stars. "Get some rest," she said. "Tomorrow you'll start learning how we really fight." That night, Zekthara lay on the narrow human bed and tried to process what he had witnessed. Everything about these humans contradicted what he knew about military science. They were disorganized, casual, and seemed to treat warfare like some kind of game. Yet something in their eyes, something in the way they spoke about death and sacrifice, made his scales prickle with unease. Through the thin walls, he could hear human voices talking and laughing in the corridors. Somewhere, someone was playing music on a stringed instrument. It sounded almost cheerful. How could they be so calm knowing that in 4 days, they would face an enemy fleet twice their size? As sleep finally came, Zekthara's last thought was a question that would haunt him in the days ahead. What did these humans know about war that the rest of the galaxy did not? 3 weeks had passed since Zekthara came aboard the Defiant Dawn, and every day brought new confusion. The humans continued to behave in ways that made no sense according to everything he knew about military operations. This morning, he watched engineer Danny Sullivan modify a standard plasma rifle in the ship's workshop. The human was adding what looked like primitive chemical explosive devices to the weapon's power coupling. Zekthara's scales twitched with worry as sparks flew from Danny's welding torch. "Is that modification safe?" Zekthara asked, staying a careful distance from the workbench. Danny looked up and grinned, his face smudged with grease. "Safe? Hell no. But it'll punch through hegemony armor like butter. Sometimes you gotta risk blowing yourself up to get the job done." The engineer went back to his work, humming a human tune. Zekthara had learned that humans often made music while they worked, especially when preparing for battle. It was another behavior that made no logical sense. Why waste energy on meaningless sounds when you could focus on the task at hand? Later that day, Communications Officer Maria Santos showed Zekathara how human battle communications worked. Instead of the formal military protocols used by civilized species, humans used coded slang and casual conversation during combat. When Captain Rodriguez says she's going fishing, it means she's hunting enemy scouts, Maria explained as she adjusted her headset. If someone calls for a barbecue, they want artillery support on their position. And if you hear someone say they're going home early, that means they're about to ram an enemy ship. Zekthara's translator struggled with these concepts. But why not use clear, direct language? In battle, confusion can be deadly. Maria shrugged. Sometimes being confusing is the point. If the enemy intercepts our chatter, we want them to waste time trying to figure out what we mean. Plus, it keeps morale up. Hard to stay scared when your commanding officer is cracking jokes. That afternoon, Zekthara joined pilot Chris Thompson in the fighter bay. The human showed him around the small craft that pilots used for space combat. The fighters were fast and maneuverable, but they looked like death traps. The armor was paper-thin and the weapons were barely adequate for fighting larger ships. These seem very dangerous to operate. Zekthara observed as Chris ran his hands along the fighter's hull. They are. We lose about 40% of our pilots in each major engagement. Chris said this without any emotion, like he was discussing the weather. But that's what makes them effective. The enemy doesn't expect us to throw away pilots like ammunition. Gives us the element of surprise. Zekathara felt sick. 40% casualties would be considered a complete disaster by Vortani standards. Any commander who lost that many people would be court-martialed and stripped of rank. Yet Chris spoke about it like it was perfectly normal. That evening, Dr. Walsh invited Zekthara to join him in the medical bay. The doctor was preparing supplies for the coming battle, organizing surgical tools and emergency medications with calm efficiency. "I wanted to explain something to you about how we think," Dr. Walsh said as he counted bottles of painkillers. I've noticed you seem disturbed by our casualty projections. Zekathara nodded. Your people seem to accept death very easily. In Vortani culture, every life is precious. We fight to minimize losses, not accept them. Dr. Walsh paused in his work and looked at Zekathara with tired eyes. We don't accept death easily. Each person we lose is someone's child, parent, friend, lover. It tears us apart every time. He went back to organizing supplies. But we learned long ago that some things are worse than dying. And sometimes the willingness to die is the only thing that keeps you alive. The words made no sense to Zekathara, but something in the doctor's voice made him uncomfortable. There was pain there, but also something harder and colder. 2 days later, intercepted communication showed the hegemony fleet approaching the system. War Commander Thex Molan was leading personally, bringing 3 dreadnoughts and 20 smaller vessels. The human fleet had only 12 ships, none larger than a heavy cruiser. By any reasonable calculation, the humans should surrender immediately. Instead, Admiral Morrison called a fleet-wide meeting. Zekathara watched as every ship captain appeared on the communication screens, their faces showing excitement rather than fear. Ladies and gentlemen, the Admiral began, our guests will be arriving tomorrow. I know you're all eager to show them our hospitality. Several captains chuckled at this. Remember, the enemy thinks this will be easy. Let's teach them why that's a mistake. Captain Rodriguez raised her hand. Permission to volunteer for the welcoming committee, sir? Granted. Take the swift strike and give them a proper greeting. Admiral Morrison looked around at the other faces on the screen. Anyone else want to show our visitors around? Every single captain volunteered. Zekathara watched in amazement as they argued over who would get the most dangerous assignments. These humans were actually competing for the chance to die. After the meeting, Colonel Brady found Zekathara in the observation deck, staring out at the stars. Penny for your thoughts? She asked. Using a human expression he had learned meant sharing one's concerns. I do not understand your people, Zekathara said honestly. You face overwhelming odds with enthusiasm. You volunteer for suicide missions like they are privileges. You plan for your own deaths like you are planning a celebration. Colonel Brady joined him at the viewport. Can I tell you a secret? We're terrified. Every single one of us. We know most of us won't see home again. She was quiet for a moment. But we learned something a long time ago. If you're going to die anyway, you might as well make it count for something. And if the enemy thinks they can scare us into giving up, they're about to learn they picked the wrong species to mess with. That night, Zekathara lay awake listening to the sounds of the ship preparing for battle. Humans moved through the corridors with purpose, their voices calm and determined. Someone was still playing music somewhere. A slow and sad melody that seemed to honor those who would not survive tomorrow. As he finally drifted off to sleep, Zekathara realized that his initial assessment had been completely wrong. The humans were not casual about warfare because they did not understand it. They were casual about it because they understood it better than any species he had ever studied. They knew exactly what they were walking into, and they were doing it anyway. The question that kept him awake was simple and terrifying. What kind of enemy chooses to fight when they know they cannot win? The hegemony fleet dropped out of hyperspace exactly when their intercepted messages said they would. Zekathara watched from the bridge of the Defiant Dawn as enemy ships appeared on the tactical display like angry red dots. 3 massive dreadnoughts led the formation, their weapons already charging for long-range bombardment. War Commander Thex Molan opened communications immediately, his scaled reptilian face filling the main screen. His voice carried the arrogance of someone who had never lost a battle. Human vessels, you are outnumbered and outgunned. Surrender now and your deaths will be quick. Resist and we will make examples of your worlds that will echo through the galaxy. Admiral Morrison stood slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. When he spoke, his voice was calm and almost friendly. Commander, I appreciate the offer, but we'll have to decline. See, my people have this bad habit of not knowing when we're beaten. Hope you don't mind if we give you a proper fight. Thex Molan's eyes widened with what looked like genuine surprise. You would choose death over surrender? Your species is even more primitive than our reports indicated. Maybe so, Admiral Morrison replied with a slight smile. But we're about to give you a lesson in primitive warfare. Dawn out. The communication ended and Morrison turned to his bridge crew. Well, you heard the man. Time to show these folks what happens when they threaten our people. All ships execute Operation Hornet's Nest. Zekathara had heard this operation discussed but never fully explained. He watched in confusion as the human fleet scattered in all directions instead of forming a defensive line. According to every tactical manual he had studied, they should group together to concentrate their firepower. The hegemony fleet moved forward in perfect formation, their heavy weapons beginning to fire at extreme range. Plasma bolts and particle beams lit up space as they targeted the fleeing human ships. To any observer, it looked like a complete rout. Then the humans did something impossible. Captain Rodriguez and the Swift Strike had been running straight toward the edge of the system as if trying to escape. Suddenly, her ship spun around and accelerated directly at the nearest hegemony dreadnought. At the same time, every other human vessel stopped running and began attacking from different angles. "What is she doing?" Zekthara asked Colonel Brady, who was coordinating tactical data from her station. "What we do best," Brady replied without looking up from her screens. "Something stupid that somehow works." The Swift Strike punched through the hegemony formation like a knife, its weapons blazing. Rodriguez was not trying to destroy the enemy ship. She was trying to get close enough to ram it. Zekthara watched in horror as her small destroyer accelerated toward the massive dreadnought, ignoring the weapons fire that was tearing her ship apart. "Swift Strike, you are breaking apart," Admiral Morrison called over the communication channel. "I know, sir," Rodriguez replied, her voice steady despite the explosions visible through her bridge windows. "Tell my kids I love them. And save some beer for me and whatever comes next." The Swift Strike hit the dreadnought's main reactor section at nearly 30% light speed. The explosion was visible across the entire system, a brilliant flash that left after images on every screen. When the light faded, both ships were gone. The hegemony formation wavered. They had just watched a small human ship destroy their most powerful vessel by turning itself into a missile. On the communication channels, Zekthara could hear enemy officers shouting questions and orders in several different languages. Admiral Morrison used their confusion. "All units execute Thunder Run. Show them what happens when you corner scared mammals." What followed was unlike any space battle Zekthara had ever studied. The humans did not fight like a coordinated fleet. They fought like a pack of wild animals, each ship attacking independently but somehow supporting the others. They used damaged vessels as weapons, turned retreats into ambushes, and treated their own casualties as tactical advantages. Lieutenant Ben Foster led a boarding party onto a hegemony cruiser after his ship was crippled by enemy fire. Instead of surrendering or evacuating, he and his Marines fought through sections of their own vessel that were venting atmosphere and on fire. They used the wreckage as a bridge to reach the enemy ship. "Foster, your ship is coming apart," Admiral Morrison warned over the radio. "I know, sir. Makes for great cover, though. These hegemony boys don't like fighting in burning wreckage. Guess they're not used to desperate people." The sound of gunfire and explosions made it hard to hear Foster's words. Sergeant Nicole Parker was coordinating evacuations from a damaged human frigate when enemy reinforcements arrived. Instead of retreating, she called for artillery strikes on her own position. "Fire on my coordinates. We're already dead anyway, might as well take some of them with us." Zekthara watched the tactical display as human ships executed maneuvers that should have been impossible. They used gravity wells to slingshot around planets, turned asteroid fields into weapons, and somehow managed to be in 3 places at once. Every time the hegemony thought they had destroyed the human fleet, more ships appeared from impossible angles. The breakthrough moment came when Admiral Morrison ordered something that made Zekthara question his translation software. The Admiral looked directly at the communication screen and said, "All ships execute Broken Arrow Protocol." Every human on the bridge went silent. Colonel Brady looked up from her station with an expression Zekthara had never seen before. It was not fear or excitement. It was something colder and more determined. "Sir," she said quietly, "are you sure about this?" "Do it," Morrison replied. Zekthara watched as the remaining human ships began moving toward the enemy formation in what looked like another suicide charge. But this time was different. They were not trying to ram individual ships. They were positioning themselves around the entire hegemony fleet. "What is Broken Arrow Protocol?" Zekthara asked Colonel Brady. She was quiet for a long moment before answering. "It means we've decided the cost of losing is higher than the cost of winning. It means we're willing to destroy everything, including ourselves, to stop the enemy." The human ships formed a rough sphere around the hegemony fleet and began broadcasting on all frequencies. The sound that came through the speakers was not military communications or surrender demands. It was music, human voices singing in harmony, a slow and beautiful song that seemed to honor the dead and comfort the living. War Commander Thex Molan appeared on the screen again, his earlier arrogance replaced by confusion and growing fear. "What are you doing? Why are you singing?" Admiral Morrison smiled, and for the first time since Zekthara had known him, the expression was genuinely frightening. "We're saying goodbye, Commander. To each other, to our homes, to everything we love, because we've decided that some things are worth dying for. The question is, are you willing to die to beat us?" The human ships began moving closer to the trapped hegemony fleet. Their weapons were not firing, but every sensor reading showed they were preparing to overload their reactors. They were going to turn themselves into bombs large enough to destroy both fleets. Thex Molan stared at the screen in disbelief. "You are insane. You would kill yourselves just to stop us from taking some worthless colony worlds?" "Not just to stop you," Morrison replied. "To show the rest of the galaxy what happens when someone threatens humanity. Win or lose, everyone will remember this day. Everyone will know that we don't surrender, we don't negotiate, and we don't give up. Ever." The singing continued as the human ships closed the distance. Zekthara realized with growing horror that they actually meant it. These humans were prepared to commit mutual annihilation rather than accept defeat. For the first time in the battle, War Commander Thex Molan's voice shook. "You would destroy both our fleets over a few meaningless worlds?" Admiral Morrison's smile never wavered. "Commander, you just learned the most important thing about humanity. To us, there are no meaningless worlds. There are no acceptable losses. There's no price too high to pay for our freedom. The only question now is whether you understand what that means." The hegemony fleet retreated from the Kepler system, but War Commander Thex Molan was not finished with humanity. 3 months later, intercepted communications revealed the truth. The commander had convinced the Hegemony Council that humans were a threat to galactic civilization itself. Now the full might of the Empire was mobilizing for total war. Zekthara stood in the briefing room of the human command station, watching Admiral Morrison study intelligence reports from across human space. The news was not good. Hegemony fleets were massing in 6 different sectors, each one larger than the force they had faced at Kepler. This time there would be no tactical surprises or desperate gambles. The enemy was bringing enough ships to simply overwhelm human resistance through sheer numbers. "They're learning," Colonel Brady said as she updated the tactical displays. "No more small expeditionary forces. No more underestimating us. Thex Molan is treating this like a real war now." Admiral Morrison nodded grimly. "Good. About time someone took us seriously." He turned to address the room full of human officers and alien observers. "Ladies and gentlemen, the gloves are coming off. The enemy wants to see what total war looks like. I say we give them exactly what they asked for." Over the following weeks, Zekthara watched humanity transform in ways that made his previous observations seem naive. What he had witnessed at Kepler was not human desperation. It was human restraint. Now he was seeing what his species looked like when they stopped holding back. Factory worker Pete Johnson showed him around the converted civilian shipyards on Luna, where once they had built cargo, haulers and passenger transports. Now they produced nothing but weapons of war. Children who should have been in school operated assembly lines, their small hands perfect for installing delicate electronics and guided missiles. "My little girl Sarah is 8 years old," Pete said as he watched his daughter wire explosive charges. "She can build a torpedo warhead faster than most trained engineers. Kids learn quick when their world depends on it." Zekthara watched Sarah work with the focused intensity of a master craftsman. Her face showed no fear or sadness, only determination. When she finished the warhead, she carved her name into the metal casing before sending it down the assembly line. "Why does she write her name?" Zekthara asked. "So the enemy knows who killed them," Sarah answered before her father could respond. Her voice was matter-of-fact, like she was explaining how to tie shoes. Supply coordinator Rachel Green explained how human logistics worked during total war. Instead of the careful resource management used by civilized species, humans operated on the principle of acceptable waste. If 10 supply convoys were destroyed getting one through to the front lines, that was considered a victory. "We make everything expendable," Rachel said as she marked another convoy route on her charts. "Ships, equipment, supplies, even people. The enemy thinks they can break our supply lines by destroying our transports. They don't understand that we built the whole system expecting 90% losses. She showed Zekthera footage of supply ships that were nothing more than engines strapped to cargo containers. No crew quarters, no life support, no defensive weapons. Each ship was controlled by a single volunteer pilot who knew they were flying a one-way mission. We call them mailmen, Rachel explained. They deliver the packages and don't worry about the return trip. The psychological warfare was even more disturbing. Major Tony Clark ran the Human Propaganda Department, which seemed to specialize in breaking enemy morale rather than promoting human victory. We don't try to convince them we're winning, Clark explained as he reviewed captured hegemony communications. We convince them that beating us isn't worth the cost. Look at this intercepted message from one of their ship captains. The translation showed a hegemony officer reporting to his superiors. The humans broadcast their casualties on all frequencies. They announce the names of their dead, sing songs about them, and promise revenge in their memory. My crew is having nightmares about the voices of dead humans calling their names. Request immediate rotation to a different sector. Clark smiled as he read. Fear is a weapon like any other. We just use it differently than most species. Instead of trying to scare them with our strength, we scare them with our willingness to die. Hard to feel victorious when your enemy treats death like ammunition. But it was General Patricia Moore who showed Zekthara the true depth of human strategic thinking. The general commanded the defense of the Sol system, humanity's home territory. Her plans were so extreme that even other humans seemed uncomfortable discussing them. If the enemy breaks through our outer defenses, General Moore explained to a room full of shocked officers, we implement the Samson Protocol. Every major city on Earth, Mars, and the outer colonies will be rigged with nuclear charges. If we cannot hold our worlds, we ensure the enemy gains nothing but radioactive ruins. One of the younger officers raised his hand. General, that would kill billions of our own people. Yes, it would, Moore replied without emotion. And it would show the galaxy that humanity would rather die free than live as slaves. Sometimes the most important victory is making sure your enemy gains nothing from defeating you. Zekthara found Dr. Walsh in the medical section, preparing for casualties that would number in the millions. The doctor had requisitioned an entire asteroid for use as a hospital, but even that would not be enough. We're not trying to save everyone, Dr. Walsh explained as he organized triage protocols. We're trying to save enough people to keep fighting. Anyone who can hold a weapon gets patched up and sent back to the front. Anyone who cannot dies with dignity and their organs get donated to someone who can still fight. The doctor showed Zekthara files of volunteers who had signed up for suicide missions. Pilots whose ships had been destroyed but who wanted to keep fighting. Engineers who had designed bombs they could carry into enemy facilities. Even children who were too young to serve in normal military roles. This little boy, Tommy Martinez, is 12 years old, Dr. Walsh said, pointing to a file photo. His parents died when the hegemony bombed New Angeles. Now he wants to volunteer as a courier. He knows the job has a 90% casualty rate, but he says his parents would be proud of him for helping. That night, Zekthara accessed the human military database to better understand what he was witnessing. What he found made him physically ill. Humanity had contingency plans for scenarios that no other species would even consider. Plan Omega detailed how human survivors would continue fighting, even after Earth was destroyed. Plan Ragnarok explained how to turn the Sol system into a massive minefield that would destroy any fleet trying to occupy it. Plan Ghost Dance described guerrilla warfare techniques for fighting from generation ships if humanity was forced to abandon all their worlds. Most disturbing was Plan Thermopylae, which outlined how human civilians should behave during occupation. Instead of accepting defeat, every man, woman, and child would become a potential resistance fighter. The plan included instructions for making weapons from household items, communication techniques for coordinating attacks, and psychological operations designed to make occupation so costly that even victory would feel like defeat. Zekthara found Admiral Morrison in his private office, reviewing casualty reports from the latest hegemony raids. The numbers were staggering. Entire human colonies had been wiped out, their populations killed or enslaved. Any reasonable species would be negotiating surrender terms by now. Admiral, Zekthara said carefully, I need to understand something. Your people are dying by the millions. Your colonies are being destroyed. Your fleets are outnumbered 10 to 1. Why do you continue fighting? Morrison looked up from his reports with tired eyes. You know what the difference is between humans and every other species in the galaxy? When you face extinction, you look for ways to survive. When we face extinction, we look for ways to make sure our enemies don't enjoy their victory. He stood and walked to the viewport, looking out at the stars where human ships were preparing for battles they could not win. Thex Molan thinks this is about territory or resources or political power. He's wrong. This is about the right to exist without asking permission, and we've decided that right is worth any price. Zekthara stared at the human admiral and finally understood what he was witnessing. This was not a war between two species. This was a demonstration to the entire galaxy. Humanity was showing everyone that some species could not be conquered, enslaved, or destroyed without paying a cost that no enemy could afford. The terrifying part was not that humans were willing to die for their freedom. The terrifying part was that they were willing to make sure their enemies died with them. The final battle began at dawn on a Tuesday, though time had little meaning in the darkness of space. Zekthara watched from the bridge of the Defiant Dawn as the largest fleet in galactic history dropped out of hyperspace around Earth. War Commander Thex Molan had brought everything. 500 ships, including 12 of the massive Fortress-class dreadnoughts that could crack planets. The human home system was surrounded. Admiral Morrison stood calmly at his command station, reviewing reports from across human space. The news was uniformly terrible. Colony after colony had fallen. Human fleets had fought desperate holding actions but were gradually pushed back toward Sol. Now the final defense of humanity would take place in the same system where they had first learned to fly. Sir, Colonel Brady reported from her station, enemy forces are demanding our surrender. They're giving us 1 hour to respond. How generous, Morrison replied. Signal the fleet. It's time to show them what happens when you corner the human race. Zekthara had seen the human battle plans, but he still did not understand them. Instead of massing their remaining ships for a coordinated defense, the humans had scattered their forces throughout the system. Some ships hid behind planets, others drifted powerless in asteroid fields, still others hung motionless in the outer darkness like dead metal. War Commander Thex Molan opened communications right on schedule. His reptilian face filled every screen in the human fleet, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who held overwhelming advantage. Admiral Morrison, you have fought bravely, but this ends now. Surrender your remaining ships and I will allow your species to survive as servants of the hegemony. Continue this futile resistance and we will exterminate every human in the galaxy. Morrison smiled and Zekthara felt his scales crawl at the expression. It was not the desperate grin of someone facing defeat. It was the satisfied look of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. Commander, you just made the biggest mistake in galactic history. You brought your entire fleet to our home system. Now we don't have to hunt you down one by one. Morrison paused, still smiling. Initiate Protocol Eden. Across the Sol system, things that had looked like dead human ships suddenly came to life. What Thex Molan had thought was a broken, scattered fleet was actually the largest trap in military history. Every asteroid, every piece of debris, every apparently disabled vessel was part of a coordinated ambush that had been decades in the making. Commander Jack Miller led the first wave of attacks. His daughter Lisa sat at the weapons station beside him, her teenage fingers dancing over the firing controls as their ship emerged from the shadow of Mars. Lisa, you sure about this? Miller asked as enemy weapons began targeting their small destroyer. Dad, we talked about this, the girl replied without taking her eyes off her screens. Mom died when they bombed Luna. Now we make them pay for every human they've killed. Their ship was one of hundreds that suddenly appeared throughout the system. The hegemony fleet found itself surrounded by enemies that had been hiding in plain sight. But this was only the beginning of humanity's final gambit. Dr. Susan Lane commanded a research station that had been orbiting Jupiter for 20 years. As hegemony ships moved to destroy what they thought was a civilian target, she activated systems that had been built in secret and hidden from every galactic intelligence service. Biological weapons deployment in 3, 2, 1, she announced over the communication channels. God help us all. Zekthara watched in horror as clouds of microscopic death spread through space around the enemy fleet. The weapons were designed to affect multiple species, including humans. Dr. Lane was killing her own people along with the enemy. Why? Zekthara asked Colonel Brady. Why would she use weapons that hurt humans too? Brady's face was grim as she coordinated defensive fire, because it's the only way to be sure. If we're going to die anyway, we might as well take them with us. The battle became something beyond warfare. Human ships rammed enemy vessels even when they had other options. Civilians volunteered to pilot bombs disguised as escape pods. Children too young to serve in combat coordinated supply runs to ships that were already doomed. Captain Rodriguez, who had somehow survived the battle at Kepler, led a squadron of ships into the heart of the enemy formation. Her voice came over the communication channels as plasma fire engulfed her vessel. "This is for every human child who won't grow up because of you bastards," she said calmly as her ship's hull began to melt. "See you in hell." The swift strike exploded in the middle of 3 hegemony dreadnoughts, taking all of them with her. But the moment that changed everything came when War Commander Thex Molan realized what the humans had really done. Admiral Morrison had not just prepared to defend the Sol system, he had prepared to destroy it. "You're going to blow up your own star," Thex Molan said, his voice shaking as his sensors detected the massive equipment hidden throughout the system. "That's right," Morrison replied. "If we can't have our home, nobody can. In about 10 minutes, Sol is going nova. That explosion will be visible from 1,000 light-years away. Every species in the galaxy will see it and remember what happens when you try to exterminate humanity." The human admiral looked directly at the camera, and his eyes held no mercy. "You wanted to see what we're really capable of? This is it. We're willing to destroy our own star system to make sure you don't win. The question is, Commander, are you willing to die for the hegemony cause?" Around the dying star, both fleets continued their desperate battle. But now it was not about victory or defeat. It was about survival. The hegemony ships tried to escape the system before the star exploded, but the humans had planned for that too. Every jump point out of the system had been mined. Every escape route was blocked by human ships that were perfectly willing to die to keep the enemy trapped. What had started as an invasion had become a mutual execution. Zekthara found himself strangely calm as he watched the star begin its final collapse. The humans around him continued working at their stations, coordinating attacks and defensive maneuvers even though they all knew they would be dead in minutes. "Are you not afraid?" he asked Dr. Walsh, who was still treating wounded crew members. "Terrified," the doctor replied as he bandaged a young sailor's burns. "But fear doesn't change what needs to be done. Our children's children will remember this day. They'll know that humanity never surrendered, never gave up, and never accepted defeat. That's worth dying for." The communication channels were full of human voices saying goodbye to families they would never see again, making jokes about meeting in whatever came after death, and promising to save places for their comrades in the next life. Some were crying, some were laughing, and some were singing the same haunting song Zekthara had heard before every battle. War Commander Thex Molan made one last desperate plea. "Morrison, this is insane. We can negotiate. The hegemony will grant your species full autonomy. We'll leave your territory and never return. Just stop this madness." Admiral Morrison was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Commander, 6 months ago you called us primitive mammals who barely deserved to exist. You said our worlds were meaningless and our lives were worthless. Now you want to negotiate?" The star's collapse accelerated and gravitational waves began tearing ships apart. Human vessels continued fighting even as they were pulled toward the growing black hole, their weapons firing until the very moment they were crushed. "Here's the thing about humans," Morrison continued, his voice growing fainter as the Dawn systems began failing. "We remember everything. Every insult, every threat, every one of our people you killed, and we never ever forgive." The last thing Zekthara heard before the star exploded was the sound of human voices singing together across all frequencies. Thousands of people about to die, united in one final song that spoke of sacrifice, love, and the refusal to surrender. The nova lit up the galaxy like a new dawn. 3 days later, Zekthara woke up in a Vortani medical facility. He had been found floating in an escape pod, one of only a few dozen survivors from either fleet. The Sol system was gone, replaced by an expanding cloud of radioactive gas that would be visible for millennia. The war was over. The Hegemony Council, horrified by the loss of their entire invasion fleet, sued for peace immediately. They offered reparations, territory, anything to avoid fighting another species that would destroy themselves rather than accept defeat. But Zekthara knew the real victory was not military. As news of the Sol system's destruction spread across the galaxy, Every species reached the same conclusion. Humanity had sent a message that would echo through history. Some peoples could not be conquered, enslaved, or destroyed without paying a price that no enemy could afford. In his final report to the Vortani Council, Zekthara wrote a single recommendation. Maintain the human alliance at any cost. These beings do not fight battles. They fight extinction scenarios, and they win by convincing their enemies that victory is not worth the price of achieving it. He closed the report and stared out at the stars, knowing that somewhere in the darkness, human survivors were already planning their return. They would rebuild, rearm, and remember, and when they came back, the galaxy would know that some species were more dangerous in defeat than most others were in victory.